Okay, greetings, and thank you for joining this video here. So if you have a Bible with you, if you want to open up to the book of Ruth. So last week we started a study of this little Old Testament book. And so today we're going to be picking up where we left off last time. So I'm going to be reading for you from chapter 1, verses 6 through 18 of Ruth. So it's a little bit longer passage, but it tells a pretty inspiring story. So let me read this passage and then we'll work through it. So Ruth chapter 1, starting in verse 6. This is what the scripture says. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the household of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will not return. We will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way. For I am too old to have a husband. And if I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and bear sons, would you therefore wait till they are grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So I started the sermon last week, mentioned that as mankind, we're just simply drawn to stories. Right? Stories have a way of pulling at our heartstrings, capturing our attentions. Stories have a way of also just kind of helping us get some perspective or handles on life, which is, I think, one of the reasons why many of us find the different stories of the Bible to be so helpful. So we know that in the end, the Bible is a theological book that tells one big story that points us to the glory of God found in the face of the Lord Jesus Christ. We also know, in light of this one big story, God has designed mankind to live in certain ways, that he has given us various commands of things we are to do and not to do. If you've read through the scriptures, you know that in the end that all of the commandments of God are boiled down into two major commandments. The first is to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, to love our neighbor as ourself. So if you read the Bible, you know this is what God expects of mankind. And I think what makes the various stories of the Bible so compelling and so helpful to us is they put real life examples in front of us, positive as well as negative examples, to help us to practically see how we should live in real life, to know how to, what it looks like to love God and to love others. So if you were with us last week, in the start of our sermon series, which I mentioned is through this Old Testament book of Ruth, you may remember that we had a negative example in front of us in the first 5 verses, a warning of what not to do. So in our passage from last week, the introduction to this story of Ruth, we read a negative example of a family who did what was right in their own eyes. And they moved away from the worship of God, they moved away from their community, and they moved into a pagan land, and they remained there for a long time. And we read that while they were away from God, from the community, we read that judgment came, and the husband and the 2 sons died. So in the introduction of Ruth, that was the story, right? This is a negative example for us to see, a real-life negative example that serves as a warning to us. The introduction part of the story of Ruth helps us to practically see of what not to do. It helps us see negative effects of failing to do what God commands us. So now today in our passage, we come to a continuation of where we left off from that story. And this continues to provide an illustration or example to us. But this time, I think we see both negative examples as well as a positive example. So on the negative example in our text, in this story, I think we see that primarily in the person of Naomi. Although I'm going to softly argue that we also see some negative example in Orpah as well. Then the positive side of our story, I think we see a great example, a great illustration of what to do, of how to love God, how to love others, which we see in the person of Ruth. She gives us some great practical examples of what that looks like. So how we're going to work through the passage for this time is going to be similar to what we did last week. I just kind of want to walk through the story that I just read for you and just point out a number of different things, which hopefully adds depth and context to the story. And then after we do that, I wanted to connect some dots for us to our own lives as a way of application, what we see in the characters. So let's just walk through the story. So starting in verse 6, which comes out in the context of verse 5 of the two sons dying, leaving Naomi, the mother, the wife, without a husband and without sons. In verse 6, we read that she arose, her and her two daughters-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. And after a long, tragic 10 plus years of living in Moab, away from God's promised land, away from his covenant community, we see in the text today that she planned to leave Moab and return to the promised land because she heard that the Lord had visited his people and had given them food. Remember last time there was a famine in the land, but now there's food. Now, let me just stop here real quick and just give you a couple of thoughts. So first, the Lord providing food for his people. This is an act of grace, an act of kindness. This is God continuing to be faithful to his people who have not been faithful to him. Right? In verse 6, the loving kindness of God provided for his people. And I think this loving kindness here sets us up for more loving kindness of God as the story unfolds. Second thought. Already in our place of study of our text today, I think we'll see that Naomi still actually is not in a good place here. In some ways, her actions are correct. In verse 6, she's returning to the land. Right? She's doing what she really should do. But what we see in verse 6 is her return to the land is not like motivated out of like repentance. It's not because of like a love for God and love for his people. This is more of like a self-preserving return to the land. She's going back because there's food there. Right? That's why she's heading back to the land. This is her like trying to live by bread alone. I mean, I think in verse 6, I think at least in some levels, this moving back to the land is actually still in line of why Naomi and her family moved out of the land in the first place. This further feels like just trying to be wise in her own eyes. It's just wise to go back to the land because there's bread there. So last week we talked about that our actions matter, not just saying one thing, but our actions matter, which they certainly do. But today I think already we're reminded that the motivation behind our actions also matter. This is a little bit of a warning here, I think, for us to like check our hearts. Like even when we're doing like the right things, like why is it that we are doing them? Is it because of love for God, love for people? Is it motivated by like God's wisdom that he reveals to us in his word? Or is this just simply us doing things based on our own personal wisdom? Verse 7, Naomi set out, and as she returned to Moab, as she starts to pull away, as the bags are packed, the moving truck is ready to push off, we read that her daughter-in-laws are with her. But somewhere along the route, maybe before they pulled out or maybe just a little ways down the road, in verse 8, we read that Naomi's like looking at her daughters-in-law. And she sees them in the moving truck. And she starts to have like second thoughts here. Girls, listen, I'm sorry, but you can't come along. Get out of the truck and go. Return to your mother's house. In fact, before you go, let me just pray for you. And let me just ask the Lord to deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. And the dead here is reference to their deceased husbands. Verse 9 of our passage, continue praying for them. Naomi prayed, may the Lord give you rest, each of you in the household of her husband. Amen. Okay, now please get out of the truck. I'm going to keep going on, and you need to go back home. Girls, this is not a trip for you. And just go back home and let's just pretend that the last 10 plus years this just didn't happen. In fact, come over here. Let me give you a quick kiss goodbye and on your way. And what we see in the story, that this information doesn't sit well with either Orpah or Ruth. So we see in verses 9 and verse 10 of our passage, they lifted up their voice. They wept. No, Naomi. That's not what's going to happen here. We're coming along. We are returning with you to your people. You're not going to leave us. Verse 11, Naomi responds, girls, listen. This is for your own good, at least for how Naomi defined their own good. She'll talk about more in just a bit. This is for your own good. My daughters, turn back, go your own way. Let's just be honest about the situation here. Girls, you know this. I'm too old to have a husband. At least in her own eyes, she was too old. At this point, she's maybe around 50 years old or so, give or take. Text tells us, even if I should have hope in miraculously on this night, I had a husband, and on our wedding night, miraculously, I become pregnant and I have sons. Girls, are you going to wait for these sons to grow and refrain yourselves from marrying others? Are you just going to wait for these sons to become of age so you can marry them? Is that what you're going to do? And by the way, let me point out here, this is a reference to the Old Testament kinsman redeemer, which is going to come into play later in this story, the person of Boaz. So we're going to talk about this a lot more in the weeks ahead. But in short, if a husband died without leaving behind a son to help provide and protect for the widow, the husband's brother would be in line then to marry the left behind widow. It'd be the brother's responsibility to make sure the widow was cared for. So in our passage here, what Naomi is saying, it says her sons have died and they had no brothers. There's no kinsman and redeemer. There's no other sons for Orpah or Ruth. She's saying, I am old. I have no prospects of marriage. I have no prospects of children. And even somehow best case scenario that I got married today and I got pregnant this night. Girls, are you going to wait for that kinsman redeemer? Are you going to wait all those years for that person to become of age, this new brother to become of age? So in the middle of verse 13, we see Naomi, no, my daughters, that's not what we're going to do here. Get out of the moving truck. I cannot provide what you need. For it is actually exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the Lord has gone out against me. I can't provide for you, girls, and clearly God is against me. Say it again. No, you can't come. My lot in life is one of complete and bitter hopelessness. And you being around, you coming with me, it's not going to be for your good, and it's just going to make things that much harder for me. So once again, I'm telling you, out of the moving truck. And this news continued to be hard for both Orpah and Ruth to hear in the story. Right, this is no doubt an incredibly emotional scene. Verse 14, if you want to look there, we read that their voices once again lifted. We read that their eyes continued to be filled with tears. And we see in verse 14, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, which this is a sign that she's going to heed Naomi's request. She's going to get out of the moving truck and she's going to head back home to Moab. But we see in verse 14, as that is happening, Ruth, she's still having none of it. And with great love, great respect for her mother-in-law, for Naomi, we read in the passage that Ruth clung to her. No, Naomi, I'm not leaving you. Verse 15, then Naomi responds, Ruth, listen to me. See your sister-in-law? Notice, she's on her way back to go to her people, go back to her gods. And I'm telling you, you got to do the same here. And you know what? If you hurry up, you can catch Orpah and not have to walk by yourself. Go. Return after your sister-in-law. Right? This is an intense scene here. There's lots of passion, lots of emotion, lots of hurt, lots of frustration. If you've had any type of relational conflict, this scene here, this is actually one that's not hard to imagine what this must have been like. Then verse 16. which is perhaps the most well-known line in the book of Ruth. This is an incredibly and powerful and moving statement that Ruth gives to her mother-in-law. She says, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people back in Bethlehem shall be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. I'm not going to die here in Moab. I'm going to die and be buried next to you in Bethlehem. And you know what, Naomi? May the Lord do so to me and more, if anything but death parts me from you." So no, I'm not getting out of the moving truck. This conversation is over. Start the truck back up, and it's time for us to head to our new home. Verse 18, after hearing this, Naomi is now silenced. She recognizes that she's not going to win this relational conflict. She sees that Ruth is determined to go with her, so she quietly turns on the key to the truck. She hits the gas, and off they go. Naomi says no more. So that's our story for this time here today. Okay, so there's several stories in the Bible that I'd love to travel back in time to kind of witness firsthand, like kind of like a fly on the wall. And this is actually one right here. I mentioned this last week, that Ruth is one of my favorite stories in all of the Bible. And within that story, this is actually probably my favorite scene. One, I love how real and raw this scene is. Right? As mentioned, if you had any type of relational conflict in your life, you can identify with this scene. Two, I love this scene just because how inspiring it is. This is an incredible example for us that Ruth puts before our eyes, both in terms of what it means to worship God and what it means to love others, to connect with others. Two of our church pillars, worship and connect. Now, for the rest of the time here, I just want to give you some thoughts on this story and how the characters of the story provide great examples or illustrations for us. So I'm very excited to get to Ruth and the inspiring positive examples she gave. But before they do that, I do want to address the other two characters of the stories, Orpah and Naomi. And these are complicated characters where I think we see some positive traits, but overall I think they actually are more like cautionary characters for us. I think there's more negative traits than positive. So let's start with Orpah. So if you were with us last week, you may remember that I mentioned that the names of the characters in Ruth kind of help tell the story. In Orpah, her name basically means like obstinate or stubborn. So I guess you could say that either she was not stubborn enough in this scene to stay with Naomi, or perhaps you could say she was maybe too stubborn to leave behind her land and her gods. So Orpah, she's a little more difficult for us to get a read on in terms of like properly evaluating her example as being like either a positive or negative character overall. I think in a lot of ways you probably can argue that the author of Ruth presents her as a little bit more of a neutral type character. And I think you can make that argument because the author doesn't give a whole lot in terms of how we are to interpret her actions. So I do think we need to be a little careful doing too much of analysis on her. However, that being said, with that caveat, let me give you just a few thoughts concerning Orpah. So first, as we look at Orpah, I do think we see some positive examples, some positive takeaways in her character. She clearly loved her mother-in-law, Naomi. She was sad and emotional to leave her behind. I guess you could even say that she gave us a positive example in that she listened to Naomi. Naomi's her elder, and she listened to her. She listened to an older woman, what she was telling her to do. And she respected Naomi, and she returned back home. So I think there's some positive things. However, that being said, my second thought is, because she listened to Naomi and returned home, she's almost kind of like the anti-Ruth in this story. So Ruth did not listen. She did not return back to the land. And there's no doubt Ruth, she's a positive character. She's positive because she refused to leave Naomi's side. She is a positive example. So that be in mind, because Orpah is almost like the anti-Ruth. I think you can actually argue that overall she's not a positive model for us to look to. So we need to be careful pushing this further than we need to. But I think she's at least a minor cautionary tale of what almost obedience looked like. I think she's a cautionary tale of what almost walking by faith looks like. Like she came close, She was in the moving truck, ready to go. She's emotionally invested. She said the right things. But as Naomi put a little pressure on her, Orpah bails. She got out of the moving truck. She headed back home to her people and to her false gods. She left to go back to what was familiar to her. Orpah had almost obedience, almost walked by faith. She got really close to taking steps of faith, to following hard after God. But when the pressure came, when the cost became more real, it ended up being too much. And she just could not do it. So I want to say again, we do need to be careful pushing this character and her example further than what the author intends us to do. But I think there's enough here to at least consider this as a warning to us, where we could almost put our faith in Jesus Christ and give our life to him. Or we could almost trust in him to share our faith with our neighbors or our coworkers or our family members. We almost do it. Or we almost start to sacrificially give of our money or of our time for others. Or we almost let our small group into a sin pattern that we're struggling with. Or we almost get baptized and follow the Lord in baptism. Or we almost get involved and start serving and using our gifts for the good of others in the church. We're leading up to the point of actually walking by faith and being obedient. We're emotionally into it. We're passionate. Okay, we're going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm telling you, I'm going to do this. Nothing's going to stop me. I'm going to do this. But then push comes to shove. And the cost comes before us. We start to feel some of the pressure of walking by faith and not by sight. And then at the last second, we just bail. And we head back to what is familiar to us. Almost obedience. Almost walking by faith. I think that's what we see, at least in a minor way, in the story of Orpah. Second character, who is also fairly complicated, who exhibited some positive traits as well, but overall I think this is a negative example to us, is Naomi, who I do think the author is a little bit more explicit in wanting us to see Naomi as a cautionary example to us. So in this story, there are some positive traits about Naomi. It seemed like she really deeply loved and cared for her daughters-in-law. The tears that were shed in the story, they're real. I don't think she's putting on a show here. She's pretty forthright and pretty honest with her daughters-in-law, that if they followed her back, culturally speaking, without a kinsman and redeemer, they were setting themselves up for a hard life. Really culturally speaking, this is almost viewed as a death sentence to not have a kinsman and redeemer, which I think Ruth is actually picking up on in verse 17 of our passage. If you can pick your eyes there, we'll look at that a little bit more in just a second here. So in the positive, Naomi, she's honest, brutally honest. She loves her daughters, or her daughters-in-law. In addition, verse 9, she prays a pretty heartfelt prayer for them. And as she prayed this heartfelt prayer, her theology in the prayer is solid. Right? She wanted good to come for her daughters-in-law. She prayed that they would find rest, to find a good husband. And theologically, what we see in this prayer, she knew that in the end, that the Lord would have to be the one to make all this happen. So there's some positive traits here. These things they're admirable. These are traits that we should see and try to model. However, that being said, what makes Naomi such a complicated character is we see other traits in her, which are problematic, to say the least. And I think these problematic traits help us to further see what we saw last week, that we are just simply not to be wise in our own eyes. And what we'll see is Naomi at this scene, which we talked about more last week, is that, right? She's just wise in her own eyes. And we also see in this scene, what also is problematic, is just the devastating effects of bitterness. What bitterness can do to someone. How bitterness can creep in and just get us all twisted around in our relationship with God and others. So once again, looking back at the passage, verses 10 through 13, no doubt Naomi is very honest about her place in life, her ability or lack thereof to produce a kinsman redeemer. So in her own wisdom, being wise in her own eyes, she is sending the daughters back to their God, right? Back to their people, back to their pagan God. Daughters-in-law, it's just not wise for you to come to the promised land of the one true God. It's not wise for you to be around his covenant people. this is just not going to be the best thing for you. So hear my wisdom. If you want a nice, stable life, just go back to Moab. This is what my wisdom is telling you. Listen, my wisdom is telling you that my God, his people, they're not worth all of the trouble. Which is like the exact opposite of what we proclaim in our fourth pillar as a church of go. And we go and share Christ, and we plead with people to leave all things behind, to follow after Christ, because he is worthy of it all. In Naomi's wisdom, she's pleading with them to stay. In her wisdom, God is not worth the cost. Right? This is wisdom in her own eyes. And by the way, I think we do need to be careful, have this mindset as well. To be a Christ follower, a Christian, to grow as a Christian, which is our third pillar, grow, there's a cost that we must continue to be willing to pay. And we need to be careful that we're afraid to call others to this cost because we think that the cost might not be worth it to them. So we might give them like our own wisdom in our own eyes, to basically allow them to stay comfortable where they're at. Maybe to stay in their sin or to stay in some type of like immaturity, to be comfortable, to not strive to grow no matter the cost. That's what Naomi is doing here, right? The comfort of life in Moab, she deemed in her own wisdom greater for her daughter-in-law than pursuing God. That was just too much of a cost. Right? This is a cautionary tale for us. Yes, we absolutely need to be sensitive how we call and plead people to pursue God and to pay the cost that might come with following Jesus Christ. But let us never forget that the reward of pursuing Christ, whatever the cost is, of comfort that we might give up, that Jesus is far worth it. Also, as mentioned, Naomi in this passage here, in this story, displayed some devastating effects of bitterness. So we're going to talk about this a lot more next week in our passage. But I do want to point out some of the bitterness that we see in this text here. This actually helps set us up for next week. So verse 13, right? Naomi, she's honest here as well. In verse 13, she's bitter. She is absolutely bitter of all the tragedy that has come to her life. And what we see in her text is she is clearly taking no responsibility for all the tragedy that took place. Right? It was Naomi's family who left Bethlehem, who left the promised land of God, who left the covenant community. That wasn't God's command. That was something they did. They were the ones who moved to Moab, to a pagan land, and remained there. They were the ones who put themselves in a place that they were apart from the blessings of God. They were the ones who moved to a place where God said there would be judgment and cursing. They did that. In the end, the heartache, the pain, the tragedy came through self-inflicted wounds. But we see in our text in verse 13, Naomi, she's blaming God. It is the hand of the Lord that has gone out against me. He is my enemy, is what she's proclaiming. She blamed God for what has happened. She believed in her bitter heart that God was set out to make her life miserable. In her bitterness, Naomi's she's accusing God of not being good. She's sticking her finger in God's face for how her life turned out. It's God's fault my life did not turn out the way I wanted it to turn out. And by the way, I do wonder, at least in part of the reason why she was sending her daughter-in-laws back was more of her just actually not wanting to look bad when she got home. She returned to Bethlehem with the daughters-in-law. She probably could rightly assume that the city would be abuzz, which we'll see in our text next week. It was. The city was abuzz when they got home. I think it would have been easy and natural for her to assume that the city would be abuzz with the locals kind of chattering among themselves. Hey, did you see that Naomi returned? And she has these daughters-in-law, but there's no husband. She has no kinsman to redeem. But what do you think she's going to do? And perhaps she's worried that this would further just make her look bad in the eyes of others. And this would then be one more thing that God, her great enemy, would use to torment her. So this is why she's maybe sending it back. But she's just worried. She's so bitter that God is against her. So we're going to talk about this more next week. But Naomi is a character that gives us a real-life illustration of the devastating effects of bitterness. And how bitterness can get us just all twisted around with a very wrong view of God that spills over to a very wrong view of how we are to treat other people. Naomi in this scene, she's a cautionary tale. Now, just a second, I do want to get to Ruth. But I do want to mention that as we think about these two characters, Orpah and Naomi, these complicated characters, they do provide a good mirror to us in many ways. This is often us, where we're just like complicated characters. We're sure maybe there's some positive traits, positive things that we're doing, but there's also all these negative traits, these negative sinful actions that we have. And sometimes the negative sinful actions, these negative traits, actually far outweigh the positive traits. Which hopefully, as we see this passage and as it is a mirror to us, it actually humbles us a bit. That we're not so prideful. That we realize that we're complicated. To go a little further, these two great characters also are a mirror to us and what church life can look like. Right? As a church, we're functioning as a family of complicated people. So I love just the local church. I love our local church. I think the local church is the most important entity in the world. I hope that you love the local church. I hope you love our local church. But listen, we can't be naive. We are a complicated group. Don't set yourself up for a fall of like some type of unrealistic expectations. Church life at times is just complicated. People are just complicated. I am complicated. You are complicated. People in your small group are complicated. People you sit next to in the pews, they're complicated. Right? We are a complicated group. And until the Lord returns, we will continue to be a complicated group. So we just need to be humble about that as well. And as we are humble about that, let's just continue to strive to have grace on each other. Which, by the way, like having and showing grace towards another, this actually helps us to fight against bitterness and helps us to work through the complications. Okay, on to Ruth. So we know, because Ruth is human, we know that she was not perfect. Ruth would have had her own complications. She would have had warts. Ruth was a sinner, just like you and I. But in the story of Ruth, the author doesn't reveal those things to us. So she's presented to us as a character who's just really a great model for us to follow after. So let me give you just two areas here that I already mentioned kind of in passing that I think she is a great model to us. So first, most importantly, I think she gives a great model of what worship of God looks like, which is our first pillar, worship. So the end of verse 16, she simply says, "Your God will be my God." This is her profession of faith. That she is forsaking the pagan gods of Moab, and she is clinging to the one true and living God, who in the Hebrew Old Testament is named Yahweh. To go a little further, when she says in this passage, "Where you die, I will die," this is communicating like Ruth, like she's counting the cost here, of counting the cost of following after God, that it could cause death to her. And she's coming to the conclusion that God is worth leaving all things behind. He is worthy of the cost of life itself. And this is what worship is. It is giving our entire life to pursue our God. Right? Worship is us presenting our bodies as living sacrifices that are holy and acceptable to the Lord. And this is what we actually fully believe as a church. We believe that God is the greatest of all treasures. He's the only true treasure that will ever satisfy the longings of our heart. And we believe that the worship and adoration is what we've been designed to do, to give our life to worship God. We believe He is worth leaving all things behind in order to have. We believe that God is worth giving our entire life to worship Him. And that is the great joy of our life. So we read the story. Ruth is a good model for us. She's a good example, a good real-life illustration on what worship looks like, to leave all things behind in order to pursue God. Second, she's also a good model, a good example, a good real-life illustration of what it means to connect with others, which is our second pillar. So in our study, our story for today, Ruth connected with Naomi with great passion and with great love. She connected with deep loyalty and deep commitment. In this passage, she's not like going to just walk away from this relationship. She's not going to allow Naomi to walk away from this relationship. Rather, we see in this passage, she clung to Naomi. "No, Naomi, you're not leaving this relationship. No, you are not going to push me away. No, you can just stop urging me to leave you and return to the land. This is what's going to happen. And you're just going to have to accept it. Where you go, I go. Where you lodge, I lodge. Your people, my people. Where you die, I do. I die. That's where I'm going to be buried. I'm going to connect with you. And I'm not going to stop connecting with you all the way to death. And in fact, if the Lord, if I stop connecting with you, the Lord may do judgment on me. Is basically what she's saying. In this passage, she's saying, start back up the moving truck. We're going to stay connected here. And we're going to head back to our new home. You know, as we think about like connect, as you hear us talking as a church about, you know, connecting, stay connected as a church, especially in the season that we now find ourselves in, you know, stay connected, keep staying connected. You know, if you're wondering practically, what does that look like? This is a great example for us to see here. Ruth, she's going to love Naomi all the way to the end. She's going to love her even through great sacrifice. Listen, she's not dumb. Ruth's not dumb. She didn't need Naomi to remind her that Naomi didn't have a kinsman redeemer waiting for her back in Bethlehem. She knew that this relationship was going to be costly. She would have known that her mother-in-law, she's a complicated figure. Right? She knew this, but she stayed connected. She was going to stay connected no matter what. You know, I think we could regularly argue that we're living in, you know, just an incredibly like non-committal time as a society. And this is why we kind of have the phrase of like ghosting. Maybe you heard some of that, heard that phrase before, ghosting, where we're just so non-committal that we just ghost, we just leave the relationships that God has given to us. And we're just like so willingly to like disconnect from others. And to say it again, Ruth, this is a great model for us. I really think that we need to see. She's a great example, a great illustration on what it looks like to walk by faith, to love God and to love others. Right? This is what we're after. To worship, to connect. Now, as I close, let me remind us that in the end, all of the great models of the faith that are before us, whether they're heroes of the faith, models of the faith in the scriptures, like Ruth, whether they're models or heroes of the faith that we see in the history books, or maybe they're just people like around you today that are just great heroes of the faith. In the end, they all ultimately are to point us to lay aside every weight of sin which clings so closely, including sins of like almost walking by faith, being wise in our own eyes, having a bitter heart, sins like not valuing God as a great treasure, or not helping others value God as a great treasure. So we see these great characters, including Ruth, and we lay aside all of our sins, and we run the race set before us, ultimately by looking to Jesus. Right? Ruth is there to help us to look to Jesus, who is the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him paid each and every cost of worship, including the cost of having to endure the cross, despising the shame that it brought on, where our Lord died in the place of his complicated, sinful people to take on the judgment on himself, our judgment on himself, only to rise again on the third day, to ascend to his heavenly throne and to sit at the right hand of God, so that by faith in him we would be forgiven and we could eternally know his love, where we'd be fully connected and united to Jesus, who is our good, kind, merciful, and loving King, who has given us an incredible promise that by his grace, through the power of his Spirit, that he will never let us go, that there's nothing in life or in death that will ever separate us from his love. His love will eternally cling to us. In the end, that's what Ruth is helping us to see. She's pointing us to Jesus Christ. And Red Village Church, through Jesus Christ, through his cross, when we see that, we see more than just simply an example or an illustration or a model of love. Rather, when we look to Christ, when we look to the cross, we see it perfectly embodied. And may we know that love, the love of God found in the face of Jesus Christ. May we rest in that love. May we identify ourselves with that love that God has for us through Jesus Christ. And may that love, the love of God found in Jesus Christ, compel us to love our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, no matter the cost. And may that love compel us to love one another all the way until death do us part. May God bless you.